Israel has a new government, and Bibi is back, baby. 2 weeks ago, Israelis went to the polls for the fifth time in 4 years and voted in a coalition headed by former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the sixth time Netanyahu has secured the country's top job. He previously served as Prime Minister for 12 years before losing office in 2021. Now, Israel is a parliamentary system, so he didn't get more votes than the competition. What he did do was pull together a coalition where his opponents failed to.
Politician Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has himself been convicted by an Israeli court of inciting racism and supporting terrorism, is pushing to head the Public Security Ministry. The office would give him control over police, prisons, and law enforcement at and around the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, a decades-long flashpoint in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. According to Israeli media, Biden administration officials have signaled that they will not engage with Ben-Gvir. Over the weekend, the Women of the Wall, a religious feminist group, issued a letter expressing concerns over the possible appointment, accusing Ben-Gvir of, quote, participating in massive violent protests that endangered our lives and continue to pose a threat to us every month. Here to weigh in on all of this and more are two brilliant thinkers, Omar Baddar, a political analyst and former director of the Arab American Institute, and Shany Mor, an adjunct fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a fellow at the Institute for Liberty and Responsibility at Reichman University. Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Just so great to have you. So Omar, you wrote a piece for us at Newsweek in which you disputed the idea that Ben-Gvir, this racist terrorist who is now part of Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling coalition, represented a break from the status quo of Israeli politics and was more sort of, in line with what you see as a central tenet of Israel, its governing and its relationship with the Palestinians. Walk us through that argument.
Sure. I don't want to downplay the extent to which it is dangerous to have people like Ben-Gvir holding security positions, because that is quite risky. And I think that we might see the consequences of that at some point in the near future. But if you look at the context from which Ben-Gvir emerged, just look at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who said that Israel is not a country of all of its citizens, but specifically of the Jewish population. You see the Prime Minister before him, Yair Lapid, who says we need to build the wall to get the Arabs out of our sight. And then you have the Prime Minister before him, Naftali Bennett, who says that there is nothing wrong with killing Arabs. Those are three different prime ministers in a row from three different parties in Israel. So it's quite clear that anti-Palestinian racism is mainstream in Israeli politics. And Batya, worse than the politics and political discourse is policy itself. Now, every major human rights organization in the world, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem and the United Nations, all agree that Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians. That means that Israel denies millions of Palestinians freedom and human rights for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. And in that political context, having somebody like Ben-Gvir emerge is simply a natural continuation of Israeli political discourse and policy as well towards Palestinians. And it's frankly a scandal that the United States, talking about not wanting to engage with Ben-Gvir, they should not be engaging with the Israeli government entirely until the system of apartheid falls.
So Shany, you spent your whole life thinking about democracy, worrying about democracy, thinking about it in depth in the Israeli context and elsewhere. I want to give you a chance to respond to what Omar said and to tell us how you see this new government.
Well, a new government hasn't been formed yet, and there's not a coalition yet. It's likely that Ben-Gvir and his party will be in the coalition, but it's not for sure. I definitely see his arrival in the coalition and his success in the recent election as something that's deeply disconcerting for all the obvious reasons. I would say that the roughly 10% of the population that voted for him, that voted for an openly racist and rather illiberal and anti-democratic worldview, has existed in the parliamentary elections in Israel throughout, and in fact in other countries as well. In most parliamentary systems in the West, there is at least a 10% of a far-right vote with views that most of us would consider quite unsavory. One of the things that happens in a conflict situation, particularly in a conflict situation governed by the rules of social media, is that anything that's a worst case from the other side becomes, for its opponents and its enemies, emblematic. So social media will always be full of posts that people salivate over, of people from one side of the conflict doing or saying something absolutely outrageous. I was a bit struck by the three quotes that Mr. Baddar gave right now, because all three of them circulate quite a bit on social media. They're all three ripped completely from context, in many cases meaning the exact opposite. The Lapid quote is from a statement of Lapid about the importance of withdrawing from the territories. The Netanyahu quote continues the next sentence about the importance of equal rights for everyone. It rejects the slogan of state for all its citizens, which in internal Israeli politics is used as a description of a non-Jewish state. And even the Bennett quote is taken from, I'm not even going to get into it, but from a radically different context. These are the rules governing social media, but it's not actually how the dispute and how the reality has been lived in Israel. That is not at all to minimize the danger of Ben-Gvir or to minimize the gravity of his worldview or its radical incompatibility with most of what has been the legacy and the tradition of Israeli democracy. The moment that he's entering the government, something which looks likely, is, like I said, a concerning moment for everyone. But it is, in a partial sense at least, quite a rupture. In an electoral sense, like I said, not as big of a rupture as we'd perhaps like to think. There has consistently been a minority of far right-wing, illiberal, anti-democratic voters in Israel, not terribly different from in other countries. The one difference in Israel is that because of the situation in the occupied territories, and particularly the civilian presence in the occupied territories, there is a place to act out much of this illiberal and anti-democratic fantasy, where in other countries, far-right, illiberal, anti-democratic types have at most a couple websites and aggressive tweeters.
Right. So that I wanted to ask you this, Omar, and also give you a chance to respond to everything Shany just said. But to what extent do you think Israeli democracy within, the borders of Israel proper is something that is different than what is happening in the occupation of the West Bank, where, of course, I think we could all agree there's, a situation there that's not democratic, but that is, at least from the Israeli point of view, supposed to be temporary. To what extent do you recognize the democracy of Israel proper towards its Arab Israeli citizens who have 95, 96, 97% of the same rights as Israeli Jewish citizens?
Sure. Just to respond to the earlier comments real quick, I'll note that Benjamin Netanyahu also warned during one of his campaigns about Arabs voting in droves as a way to get Jewish voters to also turn out. So and Naftali Bennett also has a very extensive racist history. I think people should go and look at these quotes in context for themselves and decide what they actually mean. On the question of the difference between Israeli democracy within Israel's borders as recognized by the UN and the occupied territories, I do think there is a difference. Palestinian citizens of Israel are merely second-class citizens. They enjoy many of the rights that every Israeli enjoys, with many limits on who they can marry, what neighborhoods they can live in, on Palestinian refugees being able to return, and they can't because they're not Jewish. I mean, there is plenty of systemic discrimination, but I agree that it's a drastic departure from the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, where millions of Palestinians live under Israeli control and they don't get to participate in these elections. They frankly have no rights at all. People in Gaza can't interact with the outside world because of Israel's siege on Gaza. At some point, Israel was not even allowing certain foods into Gaza, like potato chips and cookies and soda pop and so on. You're talking about a population that is living completely within the confines of what Israel allows them to exist as. And in the West Bank, it's the same. Traveling from one Palestinian town to another, you can't do it without passing through an Israeli checkpoint. So by any measure, you are talking about a population that is living completely under the control of Israel, and they have no democratic rights whatsoever. So in the case of Palestinian citizens of Israel, we can speak of discrimination. And in the case of Palestinians in the occupied territory, you can speak of complete denial of rights. And the fact that President Biden refers to this as a free and fair election, I think should be a scandal. In any other context in which a country systematically discriminates against a huge segment of the population simply because of who they are and what their ethnic and religious background is, we would not call that a democracy. It is apartheid, and it's way belated. It's way about time for the United States government to actually come around to recognize what every major human rights organization in the world has recognized.
Yeah, so Shany, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that, and then also a question. Donald Trump, claimed to be the most pro-Israel president ever. How will Netanyahu relationship with Joe Biden, what will that look like?
I can answer the second question first if you want. Netanyahu and Joe Biden are longtime friends. Both of them have a not terribly different view of the main interests that their countries have in the Middle East, in the larger Middle East, and on the Iran issue, and on the room for what is possible in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. I don't think that should be, in the short term, a terribly difficult relationship. But there are some real differences. And in particular, both of them represent domestic coalitions in one way or another with some very divergent views on a few really important issues. But I don't see any real fireworks in there. Do you want me to respond to the other things?
Yes, please.
Please do.
All right. Well, there were two categories of the things that were said, and one was regarding in Israel, and one was regarding in the territories. And again, a lot of these talking points are rehashed and well worn, but there's nothing really behind them in any comparison with any other country or in any proper legal regime. This idea that refugees not coming into Israel is somehow a discrimination against Arab citizens of Israel is obviously nonsense. Refugees aren't allowed automatically into any country, and that's not a discrimination against an ethnic group within that country. This line about people not being allowed to marry is also nonsense. What's true in Israel is that since 2003, the law that was the only one of its kind that I know of in a democratic country, where marrying someone automatically entitled the spouse to have citizenship, even if the citizenship of the spouse was of an enemy nationality, that doesn't exist in Israel. That's equally true in every other country in the world. There is no country in the world that gives an automatic citizenship to somebody on the basis of being married to one of its own citizens, and absolutely no country that does it in a situation of war. In regard to the territories, of course the situation in the territories is difficult. To discuss the occupation without talking about how it came about and what sustains it is to totally pervert the discussion. The territories are occupied because Israel won a war where it was threatened with destruction, and the occupation is sustained for 50 years because at no point has the other side agreed to make peace. The occupation could end today with a peace agreement on two states, but it was the Palestinian leadership that rejected the possibility of two states in 2000 and in 2001 in Camp David and Dahaba, rejected it again in 2007 in Annapolis in 2008, rejected it again in 2013 and 14 in Washington, in the secret talks in London and in the talks that were mediated by John Kerry. That could end in a moment with a peace agreement. And the situation in Gaza, to describe it even as occupied, is to stretch the bounds of these legal definitions beyond anything that they're intended for. There's never been in history a territory that's called occupied where the belligerent army that's supposedly occupying it has exactly 0 troops in it. What is in Gaza is a blockade, which is a perfectly normal act in a state of war. In fact, in almost every war where there has been the possibility for one side to impose a blockade on the other as long as the war was ongoing, that's been the reality. A blockade could be ended in Gaza the exact same way that the occupation could be ended in the West Bank, with a peace agreement.
We're going to have to leave it at that, you guys, but thank you so much for the back and forth. It's so rare that we get to hear both sides and that we get to hear people have civil disagreement on really important and difficult topics. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And more Rising right after this.